Welcome everyone to our session of learning Kohelet Ecclesiastes. We're still in the middle of chapter 2, and we're really looking at some really interesting and deep questions. Again, Kohelet is about the biggest question of life. What's it all about? How do we find meaning in life? And Kohelet is perfectly suited to be delivering this message to us most of the time as a king, not only writing as one of the great kings of Israel, but one of the wisest kings, one of the kings who had the most possessions and who explored, even in the stories of the Tanakh itself, many different areas. And so he's coming to give us a message about, well, what is life truly about? And last time he was talking about
wisdom and
exploring possessions, right? Building planting vineyards, and what is wealth about, and what does it mean what is foolishness and what is wisdom, and how do you explore both of those? And today we'll be looking at 2 sections, maybe 3. We'll be looking at the next section where he talks about the legacy of wealth, what happens to not just your wealth, but your legacy after you die, and you never know who's going to come after you and what they're going to do with it. And then we'll be looking at the end of chapter 2, which is his conclusion to chapter 1 and 2. Well, if all of it is vanity of vanities, and what should we be focused on, and what's it really about? The beginning of an answer. And if we have time, but probably not, we'll begin chapter 3, which is the famous, there's a time for every season. And we don't get to that this time, we'll get to that next time. Any comments or thoughts before we begin? Okay, wonderful. Share on our screen. So here we are. Go down to verse 15 of chapter 2. And Alan, would you please read for us?
Sure. So I reflected, the fate of the fool is also destined for me. To what advantage then have I been wise? And I came to the conclusion that too was futile. Because the wise man, just like the fool, is not remembered forever. For as the succeeding days roll by, both are forgotten. Alas, the wise man dies, just like the fool. And so I loathe life, for I was distressed by all that goes on under the sun, because everything is futile and pursuit of wind. So too, I loathed all the wealth that I was gaining under the sun, for I shall leave it to the man who will succeed me. And who knows whether he will be wise or foolish? And he will control all the wealth that I gained by toil and wisdom under the sun. That too is futile. And so I came to view with despair all the gains I had made under the sun. For sometimes a person whose fortune was made with wisdom, knowledge, and skill must hand it on to be the portion of somebody who did not toil for it. That too is futile and a grave error. For what does a man get for all the toiling and worrying he does under the sun? All his days, his thoughts are grief and heartache, and even at night, his mind has no respite. That too is futile. There is nothing worthwhile for a man to eat, but to eat and drink and afford himself enjoyment with his means. And even that I noted comes from God. For who eats and who enjoys but myself? To the man, namely, who pleases him, he has given the wisdom and shrewdness to enjoy himself. and to him who displeases. He has given the urge to gather and amass only for handing on to one who is pleasing to God. That too is futile in pursuit of wind.
Thank you. So I think we won't spend much time on verse 15 and 16 about wisdom. We talked a lot about wisdom in the Fool last time, unless anybody had any thoughts or comments about that. And I was going to begin verse 18. So we have this whole section, almost the whole rest of the chapter, about loathing the wealth that he'd gained under the sun, and you never know what's going to happen to it. So why do people know this? Why do people still trying to amass so much wealth?
You're talking about today?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, some people, I suppose, do it for greed. Other people do it to gain recognition. Other people do it to leave it to their children. I mean, there's probably a multitude of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
That from the nicest to the worst.
Yeah. I mean,
I think
Go ahead.
too that your sense of how much is enough expands the more you have. It's like the saying about the woman's purse, you know, it's the bigger the purse, the more stuff you stick in it, because now suddenly you have to have all that with you. When in the beginning you were just walking around with a little purse and it only had your phone and your whatever in it. I
Sure.
think there's the whole sense. I think it's for many people, it's just the human sense that yes, you have more, but now more means something different. And so you become too accustomed to, you know, $1,000 is like what $100 used to be to you. So, oh, it's only $1,000. So I need $10,000. And I think it goes on and on from there. Bigger house, whatever.
Right, and then you have to fill up the house with more stuff too.
Yeah, right.
and you have to upkeep it, and you have to pay for
Right.
security, and then everything,
Yeah,
taxes, and suddenly you're.
yeah.
But collecting great wealth is also an ego booster, right? Because if you start with nothing and you collect all this wealth, then you are proving, or you're thinking you're proving your self-worth, right? I mean, wealth has been used to prove worthiness for, for millennia, right? God favors the wealthy, the Calvinists say. There's some of that going on too. I can prove that I am a wise person by collecting all this wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Not, that's true, but there are some folks when they, at some stage in their life, realize that they're able to give back and help other people. They get to a point where they can do that. So I don't think it's one-sided. I have two children. I have four, but two of them, one of them tells me, "Oh, I work very hard. I have children." It reflects very clearly with this, and she says, "I worked so hard, and I got to a point where we should have some peace and quiet, some measure of security, and they're fairly well off." So then she says, "Why is it that we're always still having problems?" And then I have a son who's a complete minimalist. He says, "Why do I need all of these things? I don't need a lot of money. I don't need to have a house and all these goods. I'm just here to be happy and to share and be spiritual." So my question is, if anything I have left, do I leave it to who or to anybody? And does it really make any difference? Each of them is going to go off on their own. So I'm reading this and I see that reflected in many people I know, including myself, that I didn't learn. I'm becoming, now that I just turned 75, I said, it'd take me 75 years to come to some sort of a sense of all of this.
Well, we'll have someone from Temple contact you about your will.
Yes.
Good, Deb.
We have a few projects that we're being
That's funny.
I keep looking at the reference, and it's not just one reference, to toil.
And actually the word for wealth here is really toil. That's why it's to labor. So I brought it up so you could see, but it's really, so it's not really, he didn't really say I loathed all my wealth. It's really, I loathed everything I labored for, which in some ways is even an expanded notion of wealth, right? It's not just wealth, but everything I worked for. It feels even broader to me than just monetary wealth. Go ahead, Alan.
No, I mean, as I was thinking about toil, I think of hard physical labor. And, you know, if Solomon did write this, I can't imagine he did a lot of hard physical labor to get what he got. But also, he was this, it wasn't that he came up from nothing, he was the son of a king. You know, he started with some, you know, with some privilege and built on that, sure, and he gained a lot after he became king. But, you know, it's not like he started by making bricks and built a brickworks and became rich, you know, through physical labor.
But it's true. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of my father's father, who was someone who quit school at 16 and kind of like a scrappy Jew on the streets kind of guy, but he did really, really well for himself. But then he did really well, but he worked, you know, endless hours, but then he lost it all. And that happened like several times. And then he was really on top of the world when he retired and sold his company for a really nice amount. And 6 months later, he got a massive stroke and spent the last 30 years of his life, you know, debilitated and had it all before. He had like an actress wife and was sailing around the world and was just living a life. But, you know, 6 months later, and then the company that he sold his company to, which was like a multi-billionaire company, they gave him everything. They paid him for his company in shares, and they went bankrupt, and all his shares were worthless. And it was just, he did okay. He was fine, but he was, you know, it's just like, that's what I think but for him, it's even different, right? For Solomon, he's really amassed all this wealth, but I hate everything I labored for. And he might not have done physical labor, but he was, you know, he's going around the ancient world, meeting people, doing deals, kind of trying to expand his empire and, you know, working, and suddenly he has it all, but he's like, what does it give me? And as you were talking, Charles, I was thinking about, you know, some people, you know, we all know people who live in big mansions, but they're not very happy, you know, and you can live in the biggest mansion and with, you know, 30 rooms to your house, but it can feel very, very empty, and you can feel very empty inside. Yeah. So it's hard to, he does, and so he hates it, everything he labored for, but he goes straight away, for I shall leave it to the man who will succeed me. And that's really the theme of this whole section. Like you pass on your wealth to other people, and you don't know what they're going to do with it. But it's not just wealth, but it's also your legacy, right? If you can, when I was reading this earlier, I was thinking about, you know, you can work all your whole life and be a wonderful composer, but nobody discovers you. And then the guy next door who's not that great a composer, suddenly they become famous. Or when you read the history of science, and, you know, often the people who are credited with an invention or even discovering a new law, it's actually not, they weren't the first. They really stole it from somebody else, or, you know, and the other person discovered it, but then somehow nobody realized it was them. And in all the history books, it's this other person, but it's completely false. But nobody's going to rewrite history.
But it looks like everybody's going for immortality. And Solomon had the illusion, as I think a lot of people who accumulate a lot of gold do, that somehow through osmosis, the gold is immortal, so somehow I'm going to be immortal.
Mhm.
And immortality also is related in this to being remembered. So Solomon is somehow linking being remembered to being immortal too. Now,
Yeah.
is that something that anybody takes seriously? That being remembered as being immortal? It's interesting because in Jewish thought, I guess, we light candles for people
I was
who are
gonna
dead. We
say,
want to remember them. Does that do anything to them, or
we
does
fill
something
we
only
fill our
God?
hallways, of our synagogue with plaques with names of people, and we read out names once a week at services, and we have Yizkor services. But I mean, like I think I mentioned this last time, but you know, we religion and mystical systems and maybe even experience can give us an inkling of what happens after you die, but we don't really know. And a lot of people, for a lot of people, that fear of death, well, they don't know if what they do in this world has value, because you die and then you can't take your gold with you can't take everything with you. So then what you have left is being remembered, your legacy. That's all. I had this, I mentioned this several times, but I had this conversation with someone about, well, your knowledge and wisdom you accumulate, you can't take that with you. And then they said, well, you can pass it on to your students, right? But that's legacy. Legacy is the one thing you can maybe count on, but even legacy is completely dependent on other circumstances. It's completely dependent on the people that come after you. Once you're gone, you have zero control over your legacy, right? You have zero control, because the people come after you can do whatever they want with your legacy. And Solomon is the perfect person to teach us this, because he creates the biggest kingdom Israel has ever had, and amasses all this wealth and power and renown. And then his sons ruin it all, and they divide the kingdom a few years after he passes away, and Israel's divided into two kingdoms, and everything just falls apart in a matter of years. And then they blame you, right? That's the other part, right? Everybody blames Solomon. It was Solomon's fault. Like, why didn't he educate his children better? Why didn't he prepare them better? But is it really his fault?
It seems to me that the very notion of a legacy suggests a permanence that is being criticized here.
Yeah.
And that over and over again, and in this verse in particular, there's all this ceaseless activity. So the toil, and I see you helpfully put down or it shows up anyway, the word Amal, with the laborer, the sufferer, the toiler. And he is toiling in that he is devoted to an activity, intensive activity, but it's the activity. And it's not that there's any sure gain in it that has any permanence, which is the same point you were making, but it comes over and over again in the very text. So I was looking at Alter's translation for the first time, because here in verse 18, it says, no, I guess it's 19, right? He will control all the wealth I gained by toil and wisdom. And I was trying to understand the Hebrew, and I need the English translation to help me through it. And here I see that it's very much verbal. It's verbs. And not just those nouns. So I looked at Alter, who has all that was got from my toil, for which I toiled and grew wise. It was the toiling and the growing wise. But finally, after all, everybody has the same end. I'm sorry to go on so long, but
no, beautiful. And it's one of the things I've been noticing in this chapter is this beautiful repetition of words, which creates such an effect. So in these three verses, 18, 19, and 20, how many times does Amal, toil, come? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
5, 6 times the same word. If you were writing that in English, your English teacher would have crossed out 4 of them at least. And repetition. But he really making a point about that movement, that toil, that work that he did, and what is it worth, right? What is it worth? That's the question, and the wisdom comes up a lot too. And this, we've had all this repetition of verbs, and then we have this new one here, ya'esh, which is to despair, of. It's not just to despair, but it's to give up, to discard. There's a really long Talmudic discussion about when do you give up your ownership over an object. But he's bringing yet another. We've had the hevel, the futility. We've had the pursuit of wind, and we've had the toil, and now we also have this verb that's going to come up, this despair, this giving up. So,
as we're talking about this, I think back to two things. One is Riot, for those who don't know, my wife, has always said, you could work for a company for decades and then you retire, you quit, you get laid off, and you're forgotten. No matter how good a job you did, no matter what your reputation was, one day you're there and the next day you're gone. And I contrast that to a neighbor who was a captain in the Navy. He commanded a nuclear submarine. And periodically, and maybe it's just when they change command and they get a new captain, all the old captains come back. They have a ceremony. They all, or participate. And it's something like, the culture doesn't let you forget. The culture, doesn't necessarily say you were the greatest or revere you, but it recognizes you. It recognizes your contribution. So, sort of on the one hand, you have a culture that doesn't matter how you toiled and what you did. It just doesn't recognize it once you're gone. And that seems to me what this is saying, and it's very different than, what my friend experienced.
Well, the honor in the military, honoring service and honoring people's contribution is one of the reasons I think people, and the friendship, the fellowship between other people, there is something that I sense as people who have served really appreciate that, because they see how absent it is in our culture, in our materialistic world. But and even then, you might have a soldier who contributed something tremendous, who's remembered for a while, if they're lucky. But then after 100 years later, it's only the very great, and even then you never know why some are remembered and others aren't remembered, or there's some teachers or some historical figures that are absolutely famous in their time, but somehow it never translates into the next generation and is completely disappear, while others who are completely unknown in their time, generation later is suddenly famous, painters or artists, suddenly their work is appreciated and they never got to enjoy the recognition while they were alive.
Solomon keeps repeating over and over again about toiling and amassing. And yet he keeps bringing in, but wisdom never left me. So perhaps that there's one small part of him that thinks maybe something is worthwhile, because wisdom never leaves him.
It is really interesting. He keeps bringing that back. Yeah, he keeps mentioning the wisdom. It's almost to say, like, I did amass everything, but don't think I'm one of those people who only cares about amassing. I'm not quite that person. It does kind of, I agree. It kind of makes us think, okay, he has something to share with us. It's not just a complaint. He's not just kvetching with us. He's got some wisdom to teach us too. Because look, even in this verse 21, again, the word Amal, toil, and wisdom comes up. And because he's teaching us a lesson not only about those who just are grossly amassing wealth, but also those who are doing it with wisdom, as he does, right? He's not just an oligarch. He's someone who did it with taste and with wisdom, he still came to the same conclusion. Though I think what you're getting at, and I agree too, is that there's wisdom and there's wisdom, and there's I think I can't remember which tradition says this, that the wisdom is skill in action. Wisdom is skill in action. So wisdom is knowing what to do at a certain time. There's the wisdom of knowing when to make the right deal and knowing how to who to talk to, which connection to make to be successful, and that's a certain type of wisdom that helps Solomon or whoever make their fortune, but it might not bring happiness.
Rabbi, what the phrase that's translated as a grave evil, is that an appropriate translation?
That is, yeah. Yeah, it's a very strong, very ra'a rabba. Yeah, there's no other way for sometimes a person whose fortune was made with wisdom, knowledge, and skill must hand it on to the portion of somebody who did not toil for it. And it's interesting to use the word portion, right? Right. It makes one think, and who knows if this tradition had already existed at this time. That the saying that, right, who is happy? Ezehu Ashir, who is wealthy? Hasomeach bechelko, one who is content with his lot. That's a Mishnah. So who is to be content with your lot is to be happy. But here, so we all have a lot. It's a very beautiful idea, I find. So somebody's destiny is to work really hard to amass, and then somebody else's destiny is to be born their child, so they don't have to amass, but then you have no idea what's going to happen. But what's the grave evil? The not knowing, or when somebody loses all the fortune that the previous generation made, or misuses it. I mean, it is very humbling. We've all seen it. One generation can amass a whole empire, and then it can be gone like this. Even people we know whom build up companies or build up, family companies. They build up a family company their whole life, and it's, and they retire, and it's just a wonderful celebration. And 20 years later, their siblings or their children have run the company to the ground, and there's nothing left. That happens.
Yeah, there just isn't appreciation when something, so often when something's just handed to you, you haven't worked for it, so it doesn't hold the same value for you as it would have had you worked for it. So it's easier to fritter it away, or
it's just
not
life. There's
be
no way to
cautious.
change that. Yeah.
It reminds me of Mohandas Gandhi's 7 social sins, the first one of which was wealth without work is a sin.
Interesting.
Right?
I think of all these kids that I have met who as Nancy said, wealth without work. They are, I once visited my son years ago and his roommate was lying on the couch. I said, what does that kid do? Oh, he's a TFB. I said, I had never heard.
Oh, trust fund baby.
Right, I had never heard that term before. That kid literally did nothing. He just had this huge amount of money his deceased father left him.
Yep.
That's a grave evil.
Yes.
Well,
Right.
and those people don't end up, do they end up happy, or what are they?
No, what happened to this particular young guy was he died.
Wow.
He took a small job all of a sudden at a pool in a very fancy resort in Florida, because I ran into him there once, and this is going back 30 years ago. And then all of a sudden, my son told me he died. He overdosed on drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
So all that wealth didn't help him.
I mean,
Well, it's the question of what is life? I mean, why are we here? What is our purpose? And if you don't find a purpose because you don't have to or whatever, I mean, then that's where the grave evil is. It's like a waste of breath. It's
right. A waste of heaven.
it's a waste, isn't it? I mean, they're
To us, it seems that way, maybe not to them.
A waste of a life. You had the good fortune of
Getting one, right.
being
Yeah.
married, of being born to a family that could provide for you. You didn't have to toil in that way, and you could have ended up. Right, this is the next verse for Kimeh Hovela Adam. For what does a man get, or what becomes a man for all the toiling and worrying he does all under the sun? You're not only you're toiling really hard, but then you end up worrying because you're worrying what's going to happen to it. And
Right.
when I was living in Nepal for 1 year, and you'd go to the little villages, and something that all the volunteers who lived there commented on is that these people who have really, the more possessions you have, the more worries you have. It's just the truth. These people have nothing, and they had a lot less worries. I mean, they worried about the seasons, if their crops would come up or not, but they owned a mud hut and there was almost nothing inside. What are you going to worry about? They just had a lot less worries. We have so many things. We worry what to do with them, where to put them. The minimalists want to get rid of them and keep getting rid of them. And we have more stuff coming in and we worry about them coming more. They have nothing to, they really, literally, it did feel like they had a lot less to worry about because they just had a lot less things. So you just had, had a few changes of clothes. They had their work that took up so much of their struggle, but they didn't have. There was not to romanticize it, because they had their many struggles, obviously, that comes from poverty and from living in cultures that are patriarchal, and all those kinds of things. But you have a lot of. Well, you amass a lot, you have a lot of worries. There is truth in that.
I have a question.
Sure.
Wasn't Adam tasked, or I don't want to necessarily use the word curse, but in Genesis, when the serpent gives them the apple and the Lord casts them out of Eden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't Adam marked, for lack of a better word, to toil for the rest of his days? Is that the same word?
That's a great question.
It's Genesis 3:17. Is that the same word? And then that leads me to wonder if our purpose on earth, starting from the very first man, has not always been to toil. I mean, was that a deliberate act rather than an accident? I'm trying to piece this together here. Yeah. 17.
Yeah, by toil shall you eat of it.
Right here.
In
Yeah.
English, but that's not what it is in the Hebrew.
Yeah, but what is it in Hebrew? Yeah, that's my question.
It's not Amal.
Okay, so it's a different concept. Okay.
So is this more like just work?
You know what? It's even so. Let's see. Adam Amal. לא תאכל ממנו אהובה אדמה, ועיצבון תאכלנה. Doesn't, you know, Itzavon is Atsuv. This is like, it's more there. This is a not a proper translation. Atsuv, it's from your sadness, you will eat all the days of your life. Grief, exactly. I don't know why they translate
Not
it.
the same word. It's a
Yeah, I
different-
remember it has always been translated as toil.
I do too. So it's you won't eat from it. The ground will be cursed because of you. In your, by your, yeah. But let's see, what does it say in this dictionary here? Grief, pain, toil. I guess toil is then, but it's coming from not, you see it.
Sadness and hurt.
It's toil and grief, as in it's as that kind, that a different group of meanings than Amal. But what I would like to do is go back to Amal and see where else it comes up in Tanakh. That is interesting. So let's do that. One
It's so
second.
cool that you can just like look up a word and see where it appears everywhere else.
Google to the rescue.
Yeah. Well, you know, that someone painstakingly put it all out there somehow.
There we go.
That amazes me.
Amal.
Look at that.
Amal. So we do have embrace sheet in the store.
All the ones in red.
No, this is Amalek. So this is all Amalek, so it's not Amal.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so Amal comes up
Amalek is a king.
for the first time in the book of Exodus. But really, it's not a word that we're finding a lot until you see Amal is all Amalek, because which has nothing to do. Maybe it is. Maybe Amalek is somehow. So it starts to come up in Isaiah, Yeshayahu. It starts to come up in Isaiah and in prophets. So it's a word that basically doesn't exist in Torah. It's a later word. And here, look how many times. So basically, this is where it comes up. It comes up in Job a lot, and then this is Kohelet. How many times it comes up in Kohelet. So it's really, and here, this is all Kohelet. Look, all of this.
Huh.
This is a word that basically is a Kohelet in Job, especially Kohelet word. This is why the scholars speak of a style, the style of the author of Kohelet, because it's really a unique use of words. And we had a number of words that are basically Kohelet words. I mean, how many?
Languages change. Uses and vocabularies and new words are introduced.
Yeah. Well, I have a book by Robert Gordis, which is a very scholarly exposition of language in this book, and I'll have to look up to see if he says anything about Amal and how it ends up, because they believe that Ecclesiastes is a later book, that it has a lot of Aramaic influence. I'm wondering if Amal has some Aramaic. But it does come up in the other prophets. Okay, let's go forward a little bit. So all his days, his thoughts are grief and heartache. And even at night, his mind has no respite. That too is futile. These are other words that have come up a lot. The grief and heartache, pain. These are two different kinds of pain or anger. Why it seems to be, is this a big jump from one, from your wealth is hard to hand over your wealth, but instead it goes to all his days, his thoughts are grief and heartache, and even at night, his mind has no respite. Why is he gone Why has he gone there? Or is he just talking about his general condition? Is this this is the conclusion to everything we've read so far? Maybe these two verses, and I mean the last four really. But all his days, his thoughts are grief and heartache. Even at night, his mind has no respite because he's worrying so much about his legacy, or he's worrying about everything. He's just tossing and turning, can't sleep, and even that worrying is futile. It doesn't help him in the slightest. So there is nothing worthwhile for a man, but in this, and then again, this is where he starts. This is one of his first times. Okay, this is what is worthwhile. There is nothing worthwhile for a man but to eat and drink and afford himself enjoyment with his means, in his toil, with his toil, right? So basically use your toil to find enjoyment, drink and eat. And even that, I know that comes from God. Does this help you?
No.
Did you say no?
Yeah. I'm this line 24
Yeah.
is kind of, I mean, now we're talking about how it comes from God. What comes from God? Is it
Just the ability to enjoy life? Or to
is that
enjoy
what he's
eating
saying? I don't really
Even
know.
the worries.
Yeah. Go ahead, Charles.
No, I was just saying, even the worries, where does it come from? Why are you concerned? Or what is the influence?
Yeah.
Is it from a supreme being, or is it something we create? Is it
Well,
derived?
I think it's good. It's a good question about the worries. I mean, here he seems to be saying you're a bit, what life is about in some senses. Don't worry about the past. Don't think about the future. Just be in the moment and enjoy what's before you, eating, drinking, just living. But he's saying even that ability to enjoy that comes from God. You can't always control if you're going to enjoy, what's before you. There's sometimes you sit down and you just love your meal, and your simple pleasures and just being with the people you love is great. And that's not always how life works. You prepare for months for your Thanksgiving meal and think it's going to be wonderful, and then somehow it's not, and that just happens.
Well, I just, my Devar Torah for my bat mitzvah was on Breshit, and I
That's right.
a main thing that I got out of it was that God made it all happen, that the woman ate of the fruit of the tree because their lives were nothing. They were sitting around, everything was perfect. There was nothing even to think about because they just had their things to eat and animals to name and just lay around and do nothing. I mean, what was the purpose of their existence? Until suddenly they get to start actually thinking for themselves and seeing things differently and having to do some toiling and having to procreate, and suddenly there's a purpose in life. Their life has a meaning. So that's why I think this line, and even that I noted comes from God. It's, yeah, but it isn't just to hang out and enjoy what you've done. It's to actually do the things to make it happen. And I think God did give us that too, by giving us the ability to think for ourselves and do for ourselves and make decisions and make choices and so on.
Well, maybe Adam and Eve didn't need a purpose. Maybe they were maybe that form of existence doesn't need a purpose. Now, what does that mean, not to need a purpose? To simply, and in fact, I think he's noting that. He says, even that I noted come from God. This is sort of occasional pleasures or some sort of thing that leaks in from some place. That occasional thing doesn't give you a purpose. I mean, you could live your life for that, but maybe Adam and Eve were better off without the purposes, without the projects, without the accumulations, without all of the stuff that came from eating of this, eating or knowing this thing. Now, I'm not sure what I feel about that, but you have to get, is it possible to be totally, totally comfortable with no purpose?
But
No
I think
purpose.
it's great that we're talking about Adam and Eve, because the word Adam also comes up a million times, right? En tov Adam, because Adam is one way to say man, but he could have used a different one. He could have used Ish, but Adam, right? He's talking about Adam. He's talking about kind of the existence, being an Adam, being a Ben Adam, being a person, a child of Adam. So it's great that we're going in that very profound kind of, what is it about? And as you were both talking, I was thinking about the next chapter, which is there's a season for every, there's a time for every season. So maybe there is that time where you're looking for purpose and you're living for purpose and you're building in the world. But then there's a time where you don't have purpose, you're just are. And that's just being as you are, as Adam and Eve were before they ate of the fruit, is more profound than purpose. And I mean, that's a really big thing to say, more profound than purpose. But this world is a world of activity, and the way our tradition imagines the next world is it's not in the same way a world of activity, but it's a world of being. Just the way Shabbat, right? Shabbat is the opposite of activity, right? Shabbat is just being, and Shabbat is a palace in time where you just are, and there you find total fulfillment, and it's a taste of Olam Haba. It's a taste of the world to come, where you don't have to toil for meaning. But the nature of our world is of the 6 days where you work and you work and you work to find what you need, what it is. So in some ways, then this connects to the idea of Kohelet being an elderly person. I've toiled my whole life, and so what now? And then what is the purpose of all that toil? And now I'm looking for something that's beyond creating. I just want to find a purpose in being, or to
If that, in that sense, I think of it as being very sad, because if you're already whatever age you are and you haven't had a sense of, I don't know, comfort and accomplishment and whatever, I don't know.
No, I hear you.
But you can give that up too. I mean,
Yeah.
that can become the stuff that happens under the sun. Everything under the sun has motion, by the way, which he's going to pick up in the next thing. And motion implies purpose, and motion implies time. And what he's doing is he's pulling away from that completely.
Mhm.
He's disconnecting from motion, time, purpose, meaning, and he's getting into, maybe he'll tell us something else, or maybe we have to figure it out from looking in between the words, or whatever way we're going to look to be able to find that. But he's not into purpose anymore. And I don't feel sad for him. He's accomplished whatever he wanted to accomplish under the sun. And now he's in a different spot. He's amassed all this stuff. And he's saying, now what? And the now what is really what he's looking for in this. He's completely rejecting, completely disconnecting himself from all the stuff under the sun, because it's breath. It's just emptiness. It's just floating emptiness. But
there's something really nice about that.
Sure.
Because if all you're doing in your final years is holding on to what you created before, and you don't ask what's next, then that just decline. What are you just going to do? Hold on to what came before? But he's doing something which is very brave, and so brave or notable. He's all of that I amassed, which you couldn't do better than King Solomon did. But he's saying, even no, that wasn't that important. What now? And I was thinking, as you were saying, as you were talking, Deb, about I mentioned it before, but I once worked for this elderly rabbi. When I was a young rabbinical student, and he was a 90-year-old rabbi who'd been ordained in Berlin before the war, an Orthodox rabbi, and I was helping him kind of put together all of his sermons from his whole life. It's really great work. But his wife, they were both Orthodox, and he was a diamond dealer as well. Anyway, his wife.
I like the touch of the diamond dealer.
Yeah, no, he was, because that was in some
Don't
ways he
make a
wasn't.
lot of money as a rabbi.
Yeah, but he was doing just fine. But his you know, he could afford to hire someone to help put together all of his. Anyway, so his wife was also a scholar, and she'd been a scholar of Jewish of stuff for many years and was pretty well known. But it was amazing seeing them both in their older years. And he was a heart person, and he was older than she was, and he really had this attitude of like, I don't care. He was forgetting, like he couldn't remember like some of the basic words from the liturgy, from the high holidays. He's like, what is it? Tshuva, it's tefillah. I just couldn't remember the tzedakah, and he was kind of forgetting all these things. But he didn't care. He just didn't care about it, you know. And you'd be like, you know, because he still with his means was supporting a whole Orthodox minyan, and he's like, every mincha I give them the same drash year after year, and they don't say anything, and they're stupid, you know. But you know, and he was just going on, and his wife was also a lovely person, but she was a more of an intellectual type, and she was also suffering from memory loss, and she was really having a hard time with it. It was because her whole being was wrapped around her intellect, and suddenly she was losing it, and it was really, really hard for her. And I really could see what she was going through with that, because it was, you know, she prized herself so much on that, and suddenly she no longer had access to it. And I always found it to be a very profound lesson on kind of what you hold on to and what's left afterwards. And it's really, really, really interesting.
I would add to the question, now what? I would add the word at the end of now what? What for?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when I say that it's sad, I'm not thinking about the actual, like the wealth and things of that nature. I'm thinking like for myself, the value of my life, I feel, is that I raised these daughters and who they've become, and what reward that is for me. And I think that gave me purpose. My purpose was to raise my daughters and have them become these incredible women. You know, I feel like this guy is just really focused on the stuff, and oh gosh, and then it's just going to go out there, and I just feel like maybe if he could find a way to think more about those intangibles, that he would find more value in his life. And I think that's what God's, you know, what the value of God in our life is to help bring that, you know, the spirituality of our life and the more ethereal existence, that I think we gain by working and doing. You know, if you're just sitting around, you're not going to, you know, the kids are just going to raise themselves and be perfect. But if you're, you know, if you have, you know, actual interaction and actual hands-on something, I think that you derive more than just the tangible material result of that. I think that there's something, you know, you feel good after you know, I go out and I shovel, and I hate shoveling, but I go out and shovel and I feel so good. And I know I had a good workout, and I do it every time. I don't hire the guy down the street or the kid next door. I do it because I know that I'm going to feel really good afterwards. I hate it the whole time I'm doing it, but then I come inside and I'm like, oh my God, my whole body is killing me, but you know, that was good. So I think that that's the thing that's important. It's the getting the value out of something that isn't necessarily your other kind of reward.
I share that same sentiment, and I see that not only the legacy, not only see my children, but what they're passing on to our grandchildren as far as continuing the tradition of the religion, and just something we instilled in our children. We had to really make an effort for, in our circumstances, being semi-isolated in Costa Rica in a certain sense, but then with what my wife and I did, I could see, their children have been very faithful and continue, but I see that without us and doing any prompting, they're doing that with their own children. And so,
Because
for
you
me,
gave
as
them the
mentioned-
tools. You gave them
Yeah.
all the tools and they did something with it.
and most of them, and they're focused on trying to help other people.
So this is why some scholars have wondered if the author of Kohelet, right? The scholars don't think it's King Solomon, but don't believe it's likely. They wonder if Kohelet is someone who does not have a child or is estranged from their children because of that. Because of
There's
their religion.
nothing here
Yeah.
about relationships with other people.
It's not, but it's not. I mean, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that this is coming from a different place. If you were to catch Kohelet, not in this moment of going deep, what is life about? They would talk about their family. They would talk about their spouse. They would talk about their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. But this is the moment of really going deep into oneself and saying, what is not just being contented, okay, but to really going deep. Who am I and what is my life about? It's a very deep, profound, individual look at it, a meditation. It doesn't mean this is what occupies every moment of his day, but it's saying he's really trying to, ask these questions about what is it about, and there's no doubt that which is why the scholars say this is the joy of children and the joy of seeing them passing down is an answer to what Kohelet is saying, but he's in some ways not bringing that, because it's just not the direction of this particular meditation. This meditation is really an individual. And in the end, we die and we don't take our children with us, right? We go on to something else and we don't take. So there is an idea of, on some level, even though we have these wonderful relationships in our life, we are all alone, right? And we come in alone on some level, or we come in with parents, but they go at a certain point, but when we leave, we go on to what we leave alone. And so it is worthwhile to go down this meditation too, just because of that truth. And I guess we'll conclude. I have to go, but we'll begin next time with this final verse, and then we'll go on to chapter 3.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day, everybody.
You also.
Have a great day.
Bye.